My name is David Wenger. I'm here with Karina Lahnakoski, John Conroy, and Francis Scanlin. I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we're going to try to cover a few areas. First, we'll start with the U.S. regulatory situation for cannabis, and then Karina will cover Karina, along with John, will cover the Canadian landscape, and Francis will talk to Europe. First, I'll introduce my fellow panelists. So starting at the end is Francis Scanlin, the managing director and founder of Cloud9. That's a Switzerland-based manufacturer and producer of compliant hemp-derived chocolate products. John Conroy is a QC from Vancouver, deeply involved in the Canadian cannabis industry. Karina Lahnakoski is the VP of Quality and Regulatory for Cannabis Compliance, Inc. They're a global regulatory compliance firm that provides end-to-end business solutions for cannabis companies. I'm David Wenger. I'm a longtime investor in the cannabis industry. I started investing in Canada in 2016 and then in the US in 2017. My background is as a lawyer. I spent most of my career at DLA Piper in New York. DLA Piper is a global law firm. I wrote a white paper in last year called The Green Regulatory Arbitrage, a case for investing in U.S. multi-state vertically integrated cannabis companies that was read all around the world, including in Congress, and got me invited. And I'm part of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives cannabis working groups. So I'm in D.C. Twice a month working with senior congressional staffers on drafting and advancing federal cannabis legislation in the United States. We're missing today Leah Hesse, who is the Chief Compliance Officer and Chief Experience Officer at Forefront. She's not here, so I'm going to cover the U.S. Side of things in her place. So the rest of this panel is going to be a Q&A, but we'll just start off with an overview of the U.S. Landscape first, and I'll address that, and then we'll move on to Canada and Switzerland and Europe. In the United States, we are seeing historic progress on cannabis legislation. It's unprecedented what is occurring on a federal level and a state-by-state level. We're in the 115th Congress that concluded in January. There were some 60 measures to legalize cannabis federally in the United States. That is more than all previous Congresses combined in the U.S. Last year, there were about 900 bills filed across the United States in various states to legalize cannabis in various states for the entire 2018. Just halfway through March of 2019, there are more than 1,200 bills filed in states across the United States to legalize cannabis. In this Congress, there is already pending legislation covering every single aspect of legalization. What is advancing right now is the Safe Banking Act, just passed through the House Financial Services Committee. It's going to move on to the full House. It's fully expected to pass the House, and there's a good chance it will pass the Senate too. Along with banking, we're going to see a lot of major catalysts in the next 6 months, including protection for research of cannabis, protections for veterans, for federal employees using cannabis. We're going to see major progress, and I think leading to legalization within 12 to 18 months in the United States. We're at a point now where there's a snowball rolling down a hill that started an avalanche, and it's just a question of how long it will take for that snowball to pick up enough momentum, but the momentum cannot be reversed. There are congressional cannabis co-chairs working hard in the House and in the Senate. There are meetings and people working full-time in Congress to legalize cannabis. On the state side, we have 10 states that have adult use legalized, along with Washington, D.C., 33 medical states. New York and New Jersey are racing forward towards legalization. New Jersey hit a little bit of a hiccup a week ago, but I think that this time next year, cannabis will be sold in New York, probably New Jersey, or will be well on the way towards selling cannabis on the East Coast in those major states. And Michigan just legalized cannabis. Illinois is about to legalize cannabis too. We have now most of the West Coast with legal cannabis. Once those middle states in the Midwest of Illinois and Michigan legalize, and when one East Coast states legalizes, like New York, like New Jersey, like Connecticut or Pennsylvania, all the others will legalize at the same time or very quickly thereafter. So at that point, Congress will be forced to act. You have the West, the Midwest, and the East Coast. So we're moving very quickly towards legalization. I'm just going to address the Farm Bill and hemp for a little bit because there's a lot of interest in hemp CBD products from mainstream companies, not just cannabis companies. There are now large CPG companies looking at our industry and looking at hemp products in the U.S. as an initial entry point. So the Farm Bill passed at the end of 2018, moved the hemp product off of the Controlled Substances Act. Hemp is no longer a drug. It's now an agricultural product, no longer under the authority of the DEA, the Department of the Drug Enforcement Agency. It's now under the FDA, FDA's authority, the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA has stepped in and said, hang on, hemp is federally legal, but we still have authority over food and over making health claims. So the FDA has said, has put out 3 pieces of clear guidance so far. You can't add hemp or CBD from hemp to food. You can't market or sell hemp as a dietary supplement, and you can't make disease or therapeutic claims relating to hemp or CBD derived from hemp. But part of the complication is that the FDA has licensed drugs containing CBD and THC, but CBD in Epidiolex. Once something is a drug, it can no longer be added to a food. It can't be sold as a dietary supplement. But with the hemp-derived CBD, my prediction is that the FDA realizes that this is a product unlike anything else we've encountered. It's both medicinal, it's used for wellness, it's kind of goes across the spectrum, especially for cannabis. So the FDA realizes there's tremendous demand for this product. It can't be a toothless tiger. It can't just issue regulations that people won't follow. There are thousands of companies selling CBD food products in the United States. So the FDA is going to come out with regulations that reflect the fact that there is no real downside demonstrated to CBD, just an upside. And I think they'll issue new regulations that will allow CBD to take the form of, to be in a medicine, in a drug, and make specific disease claims if it goes through trials. There'll also be, I think, a dietary supplement route, there'll be an OTC route, and there'll be a GRAS route for food products. So unprecedented, but I think the FDA is going to figure it out. And let's move on to Canada. So Canada legalized cannabis federally. I think that's a major step towards the whole world legalizing. The US will come next, and I think after that, Europe will quickly follow. So let's look at Canada as a test case, so to speak, for recreational and medicinal use. So let's start with the differences between medical and adult use cannabis in Canada. And Karina, you want to take that first?
Absolutely. Yes, we are definitely a test case, and the world is watching. On October 17th, 2018, we legalized recreational cannabis. Well, we had a long time that we had already legalized medical cannabis. In terms of the cultivation and processing of the products, there really is no difference. Health Canada requires them to be manufactured under good production practices. The main difference lies in how the products are distributed. So if you're a medical patient, you will register your prescription with a license holder and have that product delivered to you directly from that license holder. The license holder can be anywhere in Canada. Whereas recreational product is distributed by our provinces, and each province has its own model. It can be a private-based model, or it can be a provincially run store. Any adult over the age of majority, or the age that the province has decided, can access recreational cannabis.
John, do you want to add to that?
Yes. Recreational use of cannabis does not involve any constitutional rights in Canada. That was established in a case I was involved in 2003 in the Supreme Court of Canada. We started in 1995. Medical, on the other hand, there was a case called Parker. Dr. Machula mentioned epilepsy. Mr. Parker had epilepsy, tried everything with his doctor, nothing worked, told his doctor that he took a couple of puffs, it would stop his seizure. And so we established that a medically approved patient has a right of reasonable access to his medicine in order to prevent the violation of his constitutional rights to the security of his person, and the right not to have that taken away arbitrarily, essentially, was the bottom line. And that was back in 2001, which led to our medical marijuana access regulations, eventually to the marijuana for medical purposes regulations, where the new government was trying to take away the right to grow for yourself or have somebody grow for you. And ultimately, in a more recent case called Allard, we established that that was unconstitutional, what they were trying to do. And to make a long story short, we've now evolved into, from the access to cannabis for medical purposes regulations, to Part 14 of the Cannabis Act. The big defect, however, is that while the provinces get to distribute cannabis in retail stores for recreational purposes, there are no equivalent medical dispensaries or compassion clubs. They exist, and they have existed since at least 1997 in British Columbia, but the government has not provided for that for medical patients. And there's a huge difference between medical patients and their access and recreational. That issue we are still currently litigating in Vancouver, and it's in the Court of Appeal. So time will tell, and hopefully we'll establish that having the ability to go to a medical dispensary will be part of the patient's reasonable access.
Thanks, John. Quickly, are extracted products legal on the adult use market in Canada today?
Not
Yes or no?
Not currently.
Okay. How about edibles? Are edibles legal?
Well, edibles, extracts, and topicals are subject to consultations at the moment in order to, they're going to be regulated as of October of this year, 1 year from the date of legalizing rec. The problem is they're going to limit the amount of THC to, I think it's 10 milligrams in the edibles and the extracts. One of my clients in Allard is a 25 gram a day approved medical patient who was brain damaged and who's now off all of his opiates and only on cannabis. He would have to buy 2,500 packages from the store in order to get his supply, so he would probably get sick from the sugar in the edibles. So they really aren't, you know, they're simply going to encourage the underground market to continue, because people, novice users may need small amounts, but there are established medical users who will not overdose or take too much. Or
so there won't be separate regulations for medical users.
The medical
for edibles and extracts.
Currently they don't plan to do that,
okay.
but that's something that we will be pushing for.
Karina, what about importing and exporting cannabis to and from Canada?
So import into Canada right now is allowed for medical scientific purposes, and export is permitted. So in both cases, you need to have the correct import-export permits and the correct licenses on both sides of the border where you're importing.
And John, what about for hemp? Can you import and export hemp and extracted cannabinoids from hemp?
Yes, it's the limitation, as I understand it, is you can only import or export, and you need a permit for each import or export for scientific, medical, or industrial hemp purposes. So there is provision for import-export of industrial hemp, and there's some technical stuff to do with very minor amounts of THC, which make it easier to import-export, but generally the same rules apply.
And the same for CBD isolate from hemp? Would that, you're allowed to export?
Yeah, my understanding would be the same.
Okay, Karina, what are the kind of highlights and maybe mistakes or things that could have gone better in Canada's rollout of adult use legalization?
I think one of the highlights is seeing the market really expand. Historically, we've been limited by a few large players in cannabis. And now that the licensing is picking up, there's a lot more opportunities for new players to bring in their products, bring in their brands. Also, with October 17th legalization, they opened up, companies are now allowed to declare new genetics into the system, which is very important for diversification of products. In terms of areas for improvement, definitely I think the advertising and labeling restrictions need to be critically assessed. If, Health Canada has said that one of their objectives is to eliminate the black market, but if you can't build a brand, that's going to be very challenging for businesses.
One of the things that I thought was Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, was most effective in convincing people that adult use would be good for Canada, actually, was the high rate of teen usage in Canada, and the fact that legalization, regulation eliminates or reduces the black market. How has that actually played out?
It's still very, very early. Certainly it is another one of Health Canada's policy objectives is to keep it out of the hands of youth. I have a 14-year-old, it's also one of my objectives, but it's still very, very early. I mean, the market still has supply limitations, and it's going to be a few years before we actually realize those objectives. And
John, what do you take away from Canada's legalization for adult use? Highlights, things that could have gone better, the effect on youth usage?
Well, currently the underground market continues to thrive. There's lots of complaints about product quality. The good thing was the announcement that they'd have micro producers and micro processors to bring in the craft industry. Unfortunately, the cost of trying to do that has become prohibitive, and so we don't have all of a sudden many micros that have been approved. So we're not doing well in bringing in the smaller producers who have been part of the market. My biggest criticism is that Canada has tried to create a new market instead of bringing everybody in, rolling everybody in, as we did for alcohol years ago with the Kennedys and the Bronfmans and the Seagrams. Why not roll them in, regulate them, give them licenses, and that way we could continue the existing industry.
Karina, how is Canada going to compete globally when cannabis can be grown for much, much cheaper in South America and Africa, and the US and California is where many, many global brands come from?
Agree. We have work to do. We do have a first mover advantage. So I think that by using our homegrown talent, as well as the research that's taking off now in Canada, I think those are advantages for us. Certainly growing outside in Canada is not as good as growing outside in Colombia, but we do have a lot of talent in our industry to bring that to the world.
John?
I just think you need to understand that Canada has legalized a little bit. You can grow 4 plants per household, and they were going to make it had to be 100 centimeters and no more, but I think they realized that the police would then have to have tape measures on their belts and that the plant might suddenly sprout between Friday and Monday. But so they abandoned that, at least. But you can possess 30 grams when you're out and about. So that's the legalization. If you breach that and go slightly over, say 5 or 6 plants or 50 grams or whatever, there's a ticketing scheme. That's what we call decriminalization, with a maximum fine, I think it's $200, something like that. But if you go above that, there's still a lot of criminal law. Canada's legislation, that their constitutional power they've used is still the criminal law, and they've simply given the provinces the permission to do the retail distribution. And so when you're above the ticketing scheme, we have still summary and indictable offenses. You probably understand better if I use the US misdemeanor for summary and felony for indictable. And the maximum penalties on indictment in Canada is still 14 years imprisonment, which the Conservative government jacked up from 7 years. And the Lahnakoski Commission back in 1972 recommended a max of 5 years. So that has all kinds of legal consequences in terms of the continued use of the criminal law. So that's the Canadian model. It's not, I mean, I think a lot of it's smoke and mirrors in order to pacify the right wing, and I'll be surprised to see people getting busted for those sorts of indictable offenses. But that is the landscape, and so there's going to be a lot to watch as we roll along.
Do you want to talk about the single convention? We didn't rehearse this, but do you want to address that at all?
I can address that. People need to understand that unlike the US, where I think when you pass a treaty, it becomes part of the law of the land, that's not the case in Canada. In Canada, we have to pass domestic legislation in order to implement a treaty. And when Canada implemented the treaty and passed the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, that's the current act, we expressly provided that the minister could make exemptions to the act in relation to a drug, a type of drug, classes of persons, and so on. So we reserved the ability to do what we're doing. So
sorry for interrupting. So in Canada, basically, you've been able to legalize, notwithstanding your participation in a single convention. Right.
We're not technically in agreement with the international treaty we signed, but we're in compliance with our law.
Understood. Right. In the U.S., that's one of the issues that they're grappling with in Congress. It's an international treaty called the Single Convention that would prevent the United States from effectively complying with the treaty and federally legalizing cannabis. For European countries, it's a big deal too. I think that just like in Canada, the U.S. will find a way around it, and at that point, it's going to cause, I think, the rest of the world to follow suit. Well, let's move to Europe, Francis. And you showed me a picture of your fine Swiss chocolate, and one thing that struck me was that your packaging was very, very clever to comply with the legal landscape that you have to navigate. So can you just give us an overview of what is the status of hemp-derived products in Switzerland and the EU more broadly?
Okay, this should be entitled Navigating a Minefield, because it's a really complicated topic. You know, up until 2018, it was already a very difficult subject, because in the different countries in the EU, you have a lot of fragmentation in terms of how the regulations are interpreted by the authorities. But things became way more confusing in January because the European Commission decided to update what's called the Novel Food Catalogue. And if you're familiar with the Novel Food Regulation, it's a regulation that dates from May 1997. At that time, the European Commission decided to enact this regulation in order to protect public health. So the spirit of the regulation is actually to ensure that food operators, they continue to innovate, but within a framework which allows for an approval process of anything that would be considered novel. That means not eaten prior to May 1997, and also to give guidance to operators and to regulators. So in January, what happened was that in the catalog, you can Google it, you can go onto the Novel Foods catalog, it's very simple, and you can type in cannabis, and you will come up with actually 3 entries at the moment. One has been cancelled, and that was cannabidiol. The other one is cannabis sativa L, and then they created a new one called cannabinoids. Now, up until the 20th of January of this year, we only had 2. We only had one, which was cannabis sativa L, and cannabidiol. So under cannabis sativa L, there was a wonderful green tick, meaning that it could be used in a food product, okay? Because it's been used for centuries in Europe. It's not novel, it's not considered novel, the plant, all right? But it also depends on the part of the plant, whether you're talking about the seeds, the flower, the leaves, and this all is interpreted differently in different legislations as well, because the bottom line with the novel food regulation is that the European Commission also defers to the individual country in terms of their own specific regulations. So then you can have these twerks and tweaks in the application of that, right? So it's very confusing, and you really need to know the regulations. Did you want to say something?
So in your
I can go on. Huh?
Yeah. So in your packaging, you cleverly intimate that there is CBD because you're getting a full spectrum hemp product without saying there is CBD in it, which I thought was a clever solution. What about
because in a full spectrum hemp product, you have CBD. It's natural, right?
Right.
But I don't say CBD. I can't say CBD. And this is why you see what's happening since probably since November, December. In a lot of countries in Europe, like Austria, they started removing a lot of products from the market, from the shelves. In Italy, that took place as well. Cannabis stores were getting fines. So it's kind of like the regulators suddenly woke up, you know, because they enacted a new novel food regulation from January 2018, replacing the 97 regulation. And it was like there was a delayed effect, because it was at the end of 2018, the different countries in Europe started to actively remove products and send warning letters to operators to remove their products.
But
right?
don't you think, though, it's really just a matter of time? Because if we talk about something like alcohol or even pharmaceutical products, regulators are struggling with the advantages and the disadvantages, the side effects, the bad effects, right?
Yeah.
Here we have a product without, there are some minor situations and certain people have certain problems, maybe can't have too much CBD, but in general terms, there is not really recognized downside to this, right? So,
no, and you saw what happened at the United Nations with the WHO, with the expert committee on drugs of dependence last year. So there was a lot of good news around CBD. There was 2 sessions last year, the 40th and 41st sessions. In the 40th session, they actually made a recommendation that CBD and also cannabis extracts should be deleted from the Schedule 1 of the 1961 Single Convention of Narcotics, right? And then in another session, I think it was October, and then October. I attended both of them as a guest, yeah. And in the second one, then they talked about THC, and they talked about analogs of THC and that. And then you saw that the recommendations were published on January 24th. There was they sent the letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations with the recommendations to delist these products from the scheduling. And on the 7th of March, there was supposed to be a vote, but it was postponed by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna. So that's still pending. I mean, it's good news, and it will give a very good positive sign to all the different countries that have signed up to that convention. But I think we're still, you know, it has to be translated into, you know, legislation.
But I mean, legislation and regulation is important, and safeguarding all these products, keeping the public safe is, of course, of prime importance. But in the United States, we have cannabis edibles for years and years in markets, and nothing has ever happened to anyone. I mean, no one has died from having cannabis edibles. People go to the hospital maybe from having way too much THC, and ER doctors say that they just tell them to go to sleep. So we're not dealing with a very dangerous situation, I think, and the regulators will just have to wrap their heads around all of it and recognize that the market demand is there, and they have to meet that demand. Did you want to add something, John?
I'm always entertained by Health Canada has on its webpage information for healthcare practitioners to advise doctors what to do. So there's a section at the very end of it that talks about overdose and toxicity, and of course the first line is there's no lethal dose, and the second one is that yes, some people get panic attacks and anxiety, and in those rare cases, doctor, when you see something like that, you sit the person down and quietly assure them that everything's going to be okay. And maybe in a rare case, give them a benzodiazepine. And I'm not sure that's good advice anymore, what we're learning about benzos. But anyway.
All right. So I think we covered a lot of ground. This industry, and it is the title of my white paper, from an investor's perspective, this is a regulatory arbitrage. From a business operator's perspective, you're, as Francis said, navigating a regulatory minefield. But I think if you're looking at this from an investor's perspective, there's a lot of mismatch of value in this industry. There's regulatory risk and overhang that suppresses valuations, especially in the United States, right, where we have robust state legal economies, but federal illegality, which causes a wall to institutional capital, to big related industry companies to enter the industry, to things like sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, and the Church of England can't invest in the United States cannabis. And also, the industry has enormous burdens, like paying 80 to 90% marginal tax rates because they can't deduct the cost of goods sold. We can't do research. You can't have interstate commerce. still hard to attract top professionals. All these barriers will come crashing down with federal legalization. So if anybody is looking at the investment landscape, I think look at it from the regulatory lens, because that's where you'll find arbitrage opportunities, where things are not valued at where they would be if this was a regular industry. And it will be one day, but if you wait till then, you might as well just invest in a restaurant or any other industry. Right now, there's a lot of opportunity here that regulations are creating.
David, can I add one more thing on the European situation?
Of course.
Just to finish the European chapter?
We spent a lot of time on North America, so go ahead.
We're in Berlin. So I really touched on just one or two things, but just to finish on the European situation, at the moment, because of what happened in January with the changes in the novel foods catalog, in March, the European Industrial Hemp Association, they met with the working group of the Standing Committee of, what's it now, Plants, Animals, Food and Feed. And this is the group of experts, basically, that the European Commission deferred to in terms of their approval process and signing off, approving or not approving anything related to novel foods. It was an important meeting because the Hemp Association were able to put before this committee good reasons, and they actually showed 14 different examples of how hemp had already been consumed in Europe since. The oldest example they showed was from a tour in Bologna, an old tower, from 1220. And it was a wonderful inscription on the walls because the inscription said, bread is life, cannabis protects, yeah, and protects in the sense of homeostasis, bringing equilibrium to the body. And then the one I like, wine is joy, right? That's how they wrote it on 1220, because there's a huge history of the consumption of hemp in Europe. Even Pope Martin V was eating hemp soup, you know? So there's a lot of good arguments. They made their case. I think they did a very good job. And if there's anybody from the EIHA in the room, hats off to them. I think it was great because they're really trying to clarify this gray area between what's medical and what's recreational, you know, because there's this whole area of relating to cosmetics, relating to food supplements, also construction and industrial uses of hemp, and they're really pushing to have clear regulations on that. The last thing that's happened just recently, on the 22nd of March, so just a few days ago, an MEP from Italy called Marco Zullo, he made a written question because a politician or a political party or a political organization in Europe has the right to make what's called a written question, has to be a written question to the European Commission. And it was a very great question because with all this confusion going on, he clearly asked the Commission, so are you going to come out with legislation regarding the area of food and cosmetics, right? He's put their back up against the wall with a request to answer that question in 6 weeks.
And if you mentioned that, Francis, a bunch of Congress men and women also, bipartisan basis, sent a letter to the FDA commissioner. Okay. Same exact letter, 2 weeks ago.
Well, by the time of the next ICBC in Zurich, that should correspond to when hopefully we'll have an answer from the European Commission, which will hopefully clarify things. So stay tuned.
So it's a moving target, a lot of these topics, and yeah, as Francis said, it's rapidly changing. Things will look different a year from now. Let's open it up to some questions. Yeah.
Let's open it up to some questions. Let's hear it again for our panel. Who's got a question? Question. Who's got a question? Anyone? Okay, of course. We'll go this way and then we'll go that way. And we're coming around. Here I come. Good thing I wore comfortable shoes. Here we go. All right.
Hey, I'm Vincenzo, American attorney. Question about, we currently have state regimes wildly disparate in how they enforce, say, Massachusetts and Maine, right next to each other and completely different laws on how you grow, who can grow, how much it costs. Do you think when we have congressional action and it's legal everywhere, that the states that haven't legalized are going to have an easier time moving forward because they don't have to undo all of the restrictive regimes that are in place now?
Under the current proposed legislation that is most likely to succeed, which is the States Act or some modified version of that, the states are going to still be left to regulate what happens in their own states. I mean, we see that in many other industries, right? Just if you want to become a barber in New York State, it's different than becoming a barber in another state. It's just a little different. And every state has their own regulations. I think we're going to see that with cannabis too. I think it might be some time before cannabis is sold in Mississippi or Alabama, but it's just their loss, I think. But every state is going to proceed differently, and they'll have their own regulations. Now, cultivation, though, is going to change once there's interstate commerce, so it's naturally going to have an effect on the realities within each state. But I think in the U.S. we have a strong state powers. States are assigned a high degree of powers versus the federal government, and they're going to continue to be able to assert their authority over cannabis, for sure.
There's a little bit of parallel with Canada and the EU, because the states are going to have to be careful that they do have a standard quality management requirement for the product. Otherwise, they're going to create more trade barriers.
Yeah, one of the things we're struggling with in the United States is that it's on a state-by-state basis now to regulate things like cannabis in food. And states are not equipped. They don't have health departments that are capable of regulating food products. The FDA regulates food products for the United States, and states are looking to the FDA for guidance, but the FDA is not regulating cannabis. So once there is federal legalization, I think there will be a much more unified situation in the United States. But despite that, states can go off and do their own thing on top of that.
And there's a big distinction to appreciate between Canada and the U.S. Criminal law is federal in Canada, whereas it's state power in the U.S. And that's why if you go back and look at history, Prohibition started in Utah and crept across the country, mainly against the Mexicans. And eventually Canada prohibited in 1923. And your federal government didn't do it till 1937. Now history is rolling back the other way, and we've legalized. So we expect your federal government to do it in the next 12 months.
But it actually is the federal criminal law in the United States that impedes the industry, right? The Schedule I status, which makes it a crime, right? To engage in commerce with cannabis is what makes it a federal crime. So we have state criminal legislation, but also federal crimes for being involved in interstate commerce related to cannabis. Any other questions?
Yeah, here. Are we on? Okay, free cannabis, hemp in Avalon, Glastonbury. My question relates to the food regulations, novelty foods, and novel ways of getting around it. I've been selling CBD products about 5 years now, one of the first in Britain, I think. And since January, what I've been doing is selling Bangsa Amrita Sindhu, temple incense, with the disclaimer that legally this product is not for use by the person. The person is the legal fiction, and that's the awareness that is happening in Britain now, is people are becoming aware of the fraud, of the name, the fiction, and all the criminality of prohibition. My question relates to, is there a movement within Europe who people have had enough of the actual blatant crime of cannabis prohibition, and we all have an essential need for this plant, so any legislation prohibiting that must be criminal. It's anti-human. And is there movement worldwide to actually people being empowered to just get on with it, grow the plant and share it within their communities?
You're touching on the whole topic of hypocrisy. Yeah? And I can't give you a straight answer for that because it still is that situation, unfortunately.
Is there an uprising in Europe?
There's a mass uprising, that's right. And that's why I think you said, it can't be stopped. It's a wave that's moving forward, it can't be stopped. It's a wonderful thing. It's fantastic. It's amazing.
What we've seen in the U.S. ultimately is that business and tax revenues are what is moving the conversation forward. This is ultimately about individual liberty and about people being able to use whatever medicine or whatever makes them feel good. But ultimately, what is driving politicians who might otherwise not be convinced is the dollars, right? So That's what causes political progress to be made. That's the reality.
I've been involved in this since 1972, so it can't happen quickly enough.
Sorry, I'm coming. Here I go.
Steffi Dudek, Analyze and Realize here from Berlin. As much as I understand that there's an outcry in the industry about CBD entry in the novel food catalog, but if CBD and hemp products are food, then they automatically fall under the food regulation that was not made to legalize CBD. It had nothing to do with it. So CBD extracts are now treated like any other plant extract, like rosemary oil or a protein extract. So for me, it's completely plausible that the moment you enrich and isolate something, you fall under the regular food regulation.
Exactly. How it should be.
Yeah.
In the U.S., we have a complication, though, where CBD has been approved as a drug. So you can't add drugs to food.
Yeah, understandable.
So it's a little different situation.
Claims are a different story. So if I look at the marketing claims, there's another issue coming. But for me, it's completely logical that an extract as food has to be treated like any other extract. Sorry.
Yeah, it's either medical or food. In Europe, it's very clear cut between the two. There's no, with this gray zone for sure, because a lot of operators don't know where to go. But that's the way the regulator looks at it. It's either medical or food, one or the other. Pick.
So, but if a big pharmaceutical company gets a patent for CBD to be in a drug product, that means that you won't be able to have it in a food anymore?
But if I'm using a full spectrum hemp, and it's naturally present.
Right. Yeah. The question I think was directly related to CBD, right? In an isolate. No. Any extract. Okay.
I remember, in the beginning of my little journey over a year and a half ago, I went to my regulator. I went to my local regulator, and I went to the controlling laboratory, and I said, "So, I want to do this. I want to make chocolate. Help me. What do I need to comply with?" And they said, "Well, basically, there's three main things. One, the plant has to be it's from the EU certified hemp, meaning that it has to be one of the hemp varieties on the common registry in the EU. There's 69 at the moment. Two, it's got to be a traditional processing technique. So very, very specifically, you can't add CBD to it or take it away. You can't manipulate it. It has to reflect what's extracted naturally from the plant. Okay? And three, no THC. No THC is 0 in Europe. In Switzerland, it's 1%. Switzerland is an outlier. You know, Switzerland is a pioneer when it comes to a lot of things. But 0 also depends on the country, you know? Because you have some people say, oh, my analytical technique goes down to 0.000 something. That's my 0. Or in another country, it's 0.3 or 0.5 or 0. And that's where the headaches start. Because if you're an operator and you're producing a Swiss chocolate like I am, I mean, I do other things too besides chocolate. I got farmer as well. But, you know, and you want to make a product that's compliant for the whole of the EU, that's tricky. Yeah, it's tricky. You have to be very careful.
In Canada, the limit is 0.3% THC, which I think is the same in the US. But there's no limits on cannabidiol or other cannabinoids in the hemp.
It's because it's not a controlled substance, CBD.
Yeah,
it never was.
We have industrial hemp regulations, and historically that really allowed you to make hemp hearts and really nothing much else until these regulations were put under the Cannabis Act, and those limitations don't exist anymore. And there are specific exemptions if your hemp product is made from the seed and is less than 10 micrograms of THC. That's not governed by the Act, other than requirements of what you put on the label when you're importing or exporting.
Fantastic. We have time for one more brief question, and then we're going to move. I'm sorry, you guys. I got it back here. But I'm sure they'd love to talk to you in the hallway. Here, one last question.
Hi, Mike Coogan from the United States. Thank you all. Could you elaborate on the disparity between the single convention and U.S. federal law and what might be done to sort of reconcile those two regulatory frameworks? Thank you.
So right now, I don't think there's a disparity. I think if the U.S. Would legalize cannabis, which is one of the drugs that's included in the single convention, then there would be a disparity. And I think that it would require the U.S. probably to withdraw from it or get the treaty amended, because treaties that the U.S. signs onto become part of U.S. federal law, basically. So something will have to be done, but the U.S. has dealt with more complicated international treaty obligations than that, and there are ways for the Congress to address that. Senator Schatz from Hawaii is particularly focused on this. I can connect you with him if you want to take up this issue further.
Thank you all so very much. I'm sorry that we're out of time. One more time for our excellent panel. That was an excellent overview. We really appreciate your time and your energy and your thoughts and your discussion.